Prior to Fidel Castro's rule of Cuba as president and leader of the communist-based government from 1959 to 2011, Cuba was ruled by many other leaders, yet none of them were ruled to fit Cuba and bring prosperity to Cuban citizens. This was because of their corrupt ruling practices, personal greed, or ineffective leadership abilities. Fulgencio Batista was one of the most infamous dictators who was known to possess these qualities, and was ultimately the cause of Fidel Castro's successful revolution. Cuba had a numerous amount of presidents in the following year, but none of them were significant and were usually made and unmade by Fulgencio Batista. However, in 1940, Batista entered elections and defeated Grau San Martin. During his presidential term from 1940 through 1944, he adequately governed the country. He increased the educational system, sponsored a huge program of public work, and fostered the growth of the economy. After his term ended in 1944, Batista decided to move to Florida, where he invested part of the huge sums he had acquired in Cuba. In the elections of 1952, Batista ran as a candidate for the elections, but anticipating his defeat, he overthrew the government in March without any bloodshed. He returned as a ruthless dictator, controlling the university, the press, and the Congress. His government brought a golden age of tourism to Cuba, as many Americans traveled to the island for relaxation and to rest at famous hotels and casinos. The American Mafia had a strong presence in Havana, and Batista worked with them to complete a few projects. Batista took a huge percentage of all casino takings and accumulated millions from the soaring economy. Outside of Havana, however, things were grim. Cubans and ruins gained very little from the tourism boom, and more of them turned into rebel radio broadcasts. As the rebels in the mountains gained strength and influence, Batista's police and security forces became more lenient towards torture and murder as a method to root out the rebellion. In 1954, the country held presidential elections that, though supposedly free, were manipulated to make Batista the sole candidate. However, militant anti-Batista elements denied the validity of the elections and organized a campaign of harassment and sabotage in the provinces. Among these groups was the 26th of July movement under the leadership of the charismatic revolutionary leader Fidel Castro, who launched their successful attack in the fall of 1958. Faced with the downfall of his regime and the growing discontent of his supporters, Batista fled with his family to the Dominican Republic on January 1, 1959. Fidel Castro was born on August 13, 1926, and enrolled at Havana University Law School in 1945. The university itself was a reflection of the affairs in Cuba. It was a dangerous place that no student dared to venture without a gun, as it was an institution that no police or army could enter, therefore providing a sanctuary for any criminal or gangster wishing to hide from the government. On February 22, 1948, Manolo Castro, Fidel's most prominent adversary, was murdered in a public theater, and Fidel was immediately taken for questioning, but was found innocent. Given the political disturbance, Fidel decided it would be best for him to disappear until things have calmed down. Fortunately for Fidel, a project by the Argentine president Juan Perón provided him the opportunity, and with that he participated in one of the most controversial episodes of his life, the Bagotazo, a course of riots in Bogota, Colombia following the assassination of Liberal Party leader Jorge Gaitan. The Argentine president founded the anti-imperialist Latin American Students Association, and the first meeting was to be held in April in Bogota, Colombia. However, when Fidel was walking towards Gaitan's office, there was a sudden burst of explosive activity in the streets, as Gaitan had just been killed in front of his own building. Colombia's streets burst into violent warfare, and Fidel, caught up in the rampage, decided to grab a rifle from a nearby police station and join the mobs. He roamed the streets distributing anti-US propaganda and provoked the populace to revolt. Enrique Overes, one of the students present, denied that Castro was a communist, but claimed that it was a hysteric, ambitious, and uncontrollable Fidel who acted in those events. Pursued by Colombian authorities, the Cuban students sought refuge in the Cuban embassy, and were later flown back to Havana, where Castro continued his law studies at the University of Havana. On March 10, 1952, Fulgencio Batista advanced into the army's main barracks in Havana, and successfully executed a fast and bloodless coup d'etat. Hatred for Batista became the single unifying force that Cuba needed badly, and for Castro, violence seemed to be the best way to oppose a military coup. He organized a group of followers, and on July 26, 1953, he attacked the Moncada military barracks in Oriental province. Unfortunately, things went horribly wrong regardless of the many preparations they did before the assault. Fidel, wounded, retreated to the mountains where he would continue the war, only this time as a guerrilla chieftain. On August 1st, Fidel and his men were arrested and sentenced to 15 years in prison. However, Fidel was freed from a political amnesty after Batista officially became president of Cuba in November 1954. Fidel, now in exile, left for Mexico determined to create a guerrilla force capable of overthrowing Batista's government. On December 2, 1956, Castro and an armed expedition of 80 men landed on the eastern coast of Cuba, which set him back immensely as he and his men had to heavily rely on the help of local peasants for the first few days, and encounters with the military resulted in all but 12 of his men to be either killed or captured. But by 1958, a movement of national repulsion against Batista had developed. Castro emerged as an undisputed leader of the anti-Batista opposition, and his guerrillas expanded their control over rural areas. Finally, the factions in the army precipitated the fall of the regime on December 31st, and on January 1st, Castro marched into Santiago with the Cuban people behind him, as he declared his leadership over Cuba. After Castro overthrew Batista's regime and his members, he set out to abolish every remnant of the old social order. He did this by making relations with the Soviet Union and by executing hundreds of members from the previous government. This action by the government was met with a lot of controversy, as many accused the trials to be unfair. In response to the outcry, Fidel's response was, quote, "Revolutionary justice is not based on legal precepts, but on moral conviction. We are not executing innocent people or political opponents. We are executing murderers, and they deserve it." Fidel proceeded with the next phase of his plan, which was to abolish private land ownership. By this stage, Fidel has nationalized $850 million worth of United States property in Cuba. The United States, disaffected by these policies and offended by Castro's new anti-American oratory, deprived Cubans of their crucial quota on the American sugar market. This, however, only strengthened Cuba's relationship with the Soviet Union. Cuba's trade agreement with the Soviet Union in February 1960 further severed relations with the United States, and the United States broke diplomatic relations with the island country in January 1961. On April 17, 1961, approximately 1,500 Cuban exiles who were financed and directed by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency staged an unsuccessful invasion at the Bay of the Pigs. The invasion, crushed by the Cuban military, was the last large-scale attempt to overthrow Castro and his regime. The aftermath of the invasion at the Bay of the Pigs led to another important event, the Cuban Missile Crisis. On October 1962, the Soviet Union secretly stationed ballistic missiles in Cuba that could deliver nuclear warheads to American cities, and in the ensuing confrontation with the United States, the world came close to a nuclear war. The standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States ended when the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its nuclear weapons from Cuba, in exchange for a pledge that the United States would withdraw the nuclear-armed missiles in Turkey, and no longer seek to overthrow Castro's regime. Meanwhile, this happened, Castro created a one-party government to handle dictatorial control over all aspects of Cuba's political, economic, and cultural life. All political protest and opposition was ruthlessly suppressed. Many Cubans of higher and middle classes felt deceived by these measures and chose to immigrate to the United States. However, at the same time, Castro vastly expanded the country's social services, spreading them to all classes of society on an equal basis. Education and health services were made available to Cubans free of charge, and employment was guaranteed to every Cuban citizen. The Cuban economy, however, failed to achieve any significant growth or diminish its dependence on the country's chief export, cane sugar. In 1980, Castro released a flood of immigrants to the United States when he opened the port of Mariel for around 5 months. Around 125,000 immigrants left by boat or on handmade rafts, overwhelming the U.S. Coast Guard and the community in Miami. Fidel took this as an opportunity to sneak out criminals or other undesirables. Approximately more than 1,700 of the Cubans were jailed due to their past history in Cuba. The crash of the Soviet Union in 1991 took Castro by surprise and meant the end of the generous Soviet subsidies to Cuba. Castro responded to the resulting economic decline and shortage of consumer goods by allowing some economic liberalization, while keeping tight authority over the country's political life. Fidel Castro passed away on November 26, 2016. He is often remembered as a villain or a hero due to the many controversies as well as improvements he made during his time in power. Most notable of these controversies was the heated feud between the US and Cuba. This was because Cuba was a socialist nation, and with communism in place, they abolished private land ownership, including establishments that belonged to the United States, which affected their economic relations with the US and made it difficult for people to buy their needs and wants. Upon establishing his provisional government in 1959, Castro organized trials for members of the previous government that resulted in hundreds of summary executions. And the widespread use of short-term arrest and ongoing harassment of people who dared to publish their opinions abolished any sense of freedom in Cuba. With the lack of freedom worsening, many Cubans decided to leave Cuba in what was the biggest exodus the US had seen at the time. Although there were many flaws in Castro's regime, he did improve many of the problems in Cuba. Most particular of these was the corruption that has plagued the nation since the beginning, an increase in education and accessibility, and a wide access of free healthcare to citizens of all classes.